Welcome to Revel 11. I'm Monica Smith, a co-creator of Revel 11, along with Joni Parsons, who's getting ready to go hiking.
Hi, everyone.
As you may know, we are a community where we try to inspire people to be their best selves, as well as being the change they want to see in the world. And being outdoors in nature is a way I know I'm inspired. And what a beautiful way to experience nature than foraging. And it can be for mushrooms, it can be for berries, it can be for anything that Mother Nature has to offer. So I'm super excited to introduce our special guest this morning, Kristen Blizzard, forager extraordinaire, and the author of this wonderful book that I'm so excited to start cooking with. So welcome, Kristen.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here with you guys this morning. Thanks for having me on.
You betcha. Why don't we start by just telling your story of how you got into foraging?
Well, Trent, my husband, and I have been foraging for about 8 years or so now. And we kind of got into it. We both had sort of peripheral exposure to it, really. I was working at a science and nature center in Avon, Colorado, that was regularly doing mushroom forays at the time. Surprisingly, I never went out with them on the foray. It was kind of strange to me now, but Trent's from Michigan and Ohio, and so Morels, of course, for him, he sort of grew up around the idea. And we had some friends that were doing it, and we went out together one day, and he and I had really just met at the time. And that first day actually was really difficult. We went on this crazy, I felt like a 10-mile hike in the mountains. We're in Colorado, and we're both a bit out of shape at the time. So it was a hard day, and it rained, and we came home with a few mushrooms, not a ton. But then we went out another time with another friend, and we had one of those days where it was just amazing. I mean, we collected the mother load of mushrooms, and that was it. That was the day. It just kind of clicked for both of us in that moment. And from that day forward, we have been foraging as much as we possibly can, fitting it into our lifestyle and sharing our adventures with anyone that wants to listen.
But at this point, you have a company around it, right? Called Modern Forager. How did that come about?
We do. Well, we are web designers by trade, and both Trent and I are old enough to have been in the space since the internet began, really. I hate to say it, but it's true. And we've been, in this kind of blogging space for a very long time. And as with anything that you're obsessed about and that you have passion for, you want to share it with people, right? So we decided to just kind of start this blog and share our mushrooming adventures. At the time, we still felt like we were these weird people that were obsessed with mushrooms, and our kids and everyone thought it was pretty strange. But we started sharing, and then we got involved with this idea, which we'll talk about later, of burn morels. And Trent is sort of a map guru, and he started, using the science behind the mushrooms to predict where we could find them. And so when you're hunting the burns, you need really great perimeter maps. You need to know if you're on private or public land, where you can hunt, what the aspects are, some of these things we might talk about later. He started making maps for us to take a trip to Oregon every year to hunt. And after a time, he thought they worked so well, maybe we should start sharing them with people. So eventually we started selling them. And that has become sort of a, large part of what Modern Forager does. We sell these digital burn maps every year for the 11 states in the West. And we continue to blog about our adventures. And then, this book all of a sudden came out of the effort too. So if you go to modernforager.com, you'll see gear and fun t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. And we continue to share adventures and do things like that. But it's really still a passion project for us. But we love it. So
I'm curious from the audience how many people have been foraging. If you could put in the chat section, just, have you been foraging before and what was it for? I'm curious, Kristen, about just you say that your obsession with mushrooms, how much of it is about mushrooms and how much of it is it just about being outdoors, and how has spending time in nature enriched your life?
right. I think that's a good question because for me, they're very much intertwined, really. We forage wherever we are. It doesn't matter where we are. We're going to get out and we're going to look for mushrooms, or that's sort of bled over into things like nettles and watercress and some of these plants even that are that we can eat that are easy for us to identify. But for me, I think being out in nature is, I grew up in Wisconsin. We spent a lot of time in the woods. For me, it's a comfortable place to be and just sort of zen in a way. There are these moments that hit you that are so special, and I'm sure everyone can appreciate that. Whether it's just the way the light is hitting a tree, or the sound or the smell. It's this very aesthetic experience being out, and so I appreciate that more than anything. It's therapeutic. But when you add foraging into the equation, it adds this element of so much more because it ticks all these extra boxes. You have this level of excitement, almost like you're going on this giant Easter egg hunt or something for adults. There's a level of excitement in just the hunt. There's this amazing phenomena where you start to realize all of the things in nature that are connected. The trees, the plants, the mushrooms, they're all, speaking in a way to one another. And, once you start paying attention to all these little things, it bleeds over into every part of your life. Not to mention, too, the amazing network of people. We have been enriched so much by the people that we've met over time and that we continue to interact and have a wonderful group with. So many reasons to get out into nature and to add foraging to your mix.
I don't know if it was in your book or your blog, but you mentioned somewhere that you consider hiking with a purpose, and I just loved that. And I tried it just recently, where I'm an avid hiker, and while I was out, and I live in an area that's had a lot of former burn areas. So I went off trail, but the thing that was so beautiful about the experience was it slowed me down. And I noticed not just, undergrowth and looking for mushrooms, but just all of the smallest thing, the noises that were going on and the little flowers and just, it was a beautiful experience for me. And wow, from our chat, we have a lot of very experienced foragers. This is so exciting to see. Can you see that as well, Kristen? Yeah. Do you have your chat up? It's pretty
I can
cool.
pull it open. Awesome.
Yeah, really. So how about for those of us who are novices, how do you recommend getting started?
Oh, goodness. Well, let's see. I think one of the very best ways to kind of increase your learning curve quickly, if you're one of these people that's just so excited to get out and do it and learn it, is to join a local mycological association in your area. Here in Colorado, we have 2 active associations, the Colorado Mycological Society, which is in Denver. And then there's one called the Pikes Peak Mycological Society, which is in Colorado Springs. And both of those organizations take people out on forays regularly. And honestly, getting out with somebody that knows the ropes or with a group, a mycological association that obviously is full of experts, is really the fastest way to learn. It's a very visual experience. You know, there's of course a fear surrounding this idea of hunting mushrooms and especially eating them. But once you arm yourself with some information, it's really no different than fishing, for example. You know, if you're an experienced fly fisher, you know the difference between a brown trout and a rainbow trout, right? Even though they look similar. Same with mushrooms. You know, the more you put into learning a little bit, the quicker you can get started. So for sure, heading out with an experienced individual or group is the number one way.
Well, in our, so I will send an email as a follow-up to this to everyone who signed up that will contain the slides that Kristen is going to show, but also more information. And I'll include even the local mycological association in Washington, and the ones that Kristen also mentioned. So I'll include those resources for sure.
Also, Monica, Barbara Ching is here on the chat. Hi, Barbara. She's the president of the North American Mycological Association.
Oh, fabulous. Welcome, Barbara.
She put a link in the chat to NAMA's website where they have a list of mycological associations by state. So
terrific.
That's a really fabulous resource.
I will include that in the email that I send out for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Of course. Well, Kristen, tell us just about your personal favorites for mushrooms.
My personal favorites. All right. Well, can I go over to the slides?
Of course you can.
The slide land here. So let's see. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can you guys all see the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess before we delve into the big mushrooms, just since we have kind of an order of the slides, I thought it would be kind of fun to start with this sort of big idea of mushrooms. And I know, Monica, you have Suzanne Simard coming up on one of your talks soon, and you guys are going to enjoy that so very much. But she will point this idea out to you as well. Some wild mushrooms need trees to exist, and a lot of the wild mushrooms that we are hunting and eating have a symbiotic relationship with a tree. So, you know, in order to become a very good mushroom hunter, at some point you really need to learn your trees. They are in an exchange where the tree is essentially sending sugars to the mushroom, and the mushroom is breaking down the nutrients in the soil and sending those back to the tree. And that's called a mycorrhizal relationship. So I'm sure you will learn a lot more about that from Suzanne, because she is really the expert. And her research is amazing on that. But it's a very cool idea, this idea that everything in the forest is connected. And I love that. It's one of the things that just makes me so happy. Another thing that comes from that relationship, which is way cool, is that mushrooms really are information agents. So, you know, they form this mycelial web, this sort of mat of roots, to simplify, in the forest, and they connect into the tree roots. And so trees send information to each other through the mycelial network. If they're stressed, they can talk about that. If they need to send resources to their saplings, they can do that through the network. So really, mushrooms they connect everything. They connect to plant roots as well. So I love this idea that they're really information agents. And then just this third idea that, you know, mushrooms are more than just food that we eat. You know, they are making news headlines now for medical reasons. You know, they're helping with depression and PTSD, for example. They can be used to clean up an oil spill, which is crazy cool. Oyster mushrooms can help clean up oil spills and things like that. They are used in gardening and in forestry and in even sometimes to control, ants and things like that. So I would just encourage you all to think of them as something more than just food that we eat. Which I think
I mean,
is,
maybe this is a silly question, but I'm just thinking about the sustainability side of picking mushrooms. I mean, should we be feeling guilty when we pick these mushrooms to eat?
Yeah, I mean, I think we will get to that a little bit later, but just to touch on it quickly, this is a conversation that we have a lot in this space. It really comes down more so to etiquette. I think mushrooms are kind of like an apple on a tree, to simplify, really. If you picked all the apples off of a tree, they would grow back the next year, right? So the mushrooms themselves don't really care. It's the forest that's important. So the trees, we need to maintain the health of the trees in the forest, and that mycelial network. So you can trample, for example, if you sent a herd of cows or a herd of people, for that matter, into the woods, and they had little respect for the forest floor, that could harm a mushroom. Of course, you have this idea that animals are eating the mushrooms out there in the woods, and similar, the idea that maybe you want to leave some for the next forager that comes through. Those are more etiquette, I would say, and personal decisions. But as far as can you overpick the mushrooms, my opinion is not really.
Yeah. And Peter just wrote that wild mushrooms definitely strengthen your immune system and help fight cancer and other diseases, which is so, I mean, I've been doing a lot of reading about it, and it sounds like that's so true. And we did as Kristen knows, we did a event with mycologist from Jamaica about medicinal mushrooms, that's on our YouTube channel. And so that will also, there'll be a link in the follow-up to that as well, which talks specifically about the health. Okay.
Yeah, medicinal mushrooms are fascinating. I mean, that's the whole, you could have a whole separate, like you said, you already had the mycologist from Jamaica, but we could talk about that for hours.
Yeah. Are you going to talk about how to avoid poisonous mushrooms? Maybe I'm just jumping ahead.
We can. Let me go to the next slide. There is I do have a slide on, safety. But let's just walk through this quickly.
Definitely.
Back up. We talked a little bit about how to get started. The big idea was join a mycological association, which is, it's really, the people are amazing too. I just want to tell you, mushroom hunters are such a diverse group of people, but yet you have this common sort of passion, and I've almost never seen anything like it. It doesn't matter, whatever, politics, gender, none of it matters. You all come together over mushrooms, and you have an amazing time. So get to know the people, they're great. But a good ID book, absolutely necessary. Just, invest for sure in an ID book that's specific to your area. Habitats and tree associations, as I mentioned, are really important to your success. Trent and I have learned a ton on Facebook groups, which sounds weird, but here's how you work that. People love to talk about mushrooms. So pretty typically you'll find a local group in your area, and it may be connected to that mycological association, but people will share pictures of mushrooms, general time of year. So something that we do, especially when we're going to a new area, for example, we went to Pennsylvania to hunt in the Allegheny a couple years ago, and we had never been there. So we found, a mushroom group on Facebook, and you can kind of go through the history of the last couple years and look at the pictures and look at the time of year where people found things, and look at where they were found. So you sort of can be a detective, if you will, and gather all this information to help you be more successful. So it's kind of a sneaky secret, with these groups. Go in there and just search the history. Look at the habitat and timing. Get out on foray, always get out on a foray, it's awesome. And then also learn some identifying characteristics. So we'll talk about that in a second when we go through the mushrooms, identifiers, and also poisonous lookalikes are really great to know. I don't have a lot of slides on that, but we can talk about it. So let me just go to the next. Here's something that I think is a good tip. Oftentimes when we take new people into the woods that are super excited, they get out there and they stop at every single mushroom on the ground. And they're like, what is this? What is this? What is this? This is so cool. What is this? If you do that and you're in it for your belly, so you want to get out and you want to find mushrooms to eat, you will probably not make it more than 10 feet into the woods after 3 hours because there's so much fungi in the woods.
That's exactly what I experienced when I went out a couple of weeks ago.
Right? So, I mean, I hate to say it, but if you're in it for the food in the beginning, you have to ignore everything but the 1 or 2 mushrooms that you're looking for, or you just won't make it very far. If you're in it, you know, as an explorer and to learn about all mushrooms, and just because you're excited, that is absolutely fine. You know, there's no problem doing that. It's just, it depends on your goal. So I always tell people that are in it to find edible mushrooms, hey, you have to ignore everything else right now. We're just looking for these 2. Start simple, choose easy to ID mushrooms, and we'll go over a few that I think are pretty easy to identify. Focus on only those that you want to eat. And this idea of the science behind mushrooms is really interesting. They're pretty predictable. So once you learn a little bit, you can use that information, and the trees, of course. So are we ready to jump into some mushrooms here?
Are you going to talk about the trees to be looking for? I mean, do you have a slide on
We will talk about
this?
them. Yeah,
Okay.
we'll talk about them a little bit with each mushroom.
Okay.
We're going to talk about today this first mushroom, Chanterelles. We're also going to talk about porcini and morels. I chose 3 mushrooms that are fairly widespread and widely hunted, not just in the US, but also in other continents. And, you know, the trees that they associate with, interestingly, kind of depend on the area where you are. So we can talk generally about trees in the West, trees in the Midwest, but, you know, we'd be here for a week if we got into, like, you know, what trees and does every mushroom associate with. So we'll touch on it just briefly. This first mushroom, the Chanterelle, is one of my very favorite mushrooms. These pictures on the right, the Chanterelles, I think that's Trent's hand that he's holding there, are from Colorado. Us mushroom hunters, Trent and I are not like mycologists, and we're not academics really in the sense of mushrooms, but the Latin with mushrooms is really important to a lot of people, specifically because the species are always changing and things like that. So, you know, when you use a common name for a mushroom, we could be talking about, I don't know, 20 different species, for example. Chanterelles have a ton of different species, but this is the Cantharellus genus generally. Lots of different species. In Colorado, our chanterelles, you can see them there in his hand, like I said, are compact. They're much tinier than you'll find them in the West. They are beautiful, fruity smelling, very orange, yellow mushrooms, and I love them very much. They have a special relationship here in the West with conifers. Hemlock, fir, and spruce trees. In the Midwest, they're going to associate with things like oaks and pine trees. You know, and this mushroom grows, like I said, it's pretty widespread. So you're going to find it in the West, in the Midwest, in the South, and in the East here. They are I think, a fairly easy mushroom to identify, although pending your region, they do have some poisonous lookalikes. Here in Colorado, we don't have many of those poisonous lookalikes. We're very lucky. In the West and in the East, they certainly do. But one of the, let's see, the identifiers on these guys, if you can see in the pictures, a lot of mushrooms that, you know, we think about traditionally have this idea of gills. They're like almost pieces of paper, singular, very thin gills underneath. The Chanterelle is unique in that it looks like it has gills, but really more so they are ridges on the mushroom. And they are decurrent. They kind of come down the stem a little bit. But I think one of the easiest ways and one of the best indicators of a Chanterelle for me is that although these are beautiful, bright orange, yellow mushrooms, the inside of the stem is always going to be white. And you can kind of see that in that picture here. Of the poisonous lookalikes, oftentimes you'll see an orange interior. You might see a hollow interior.
And Kristen, when you pick mushrooms, do you generally just use your hands, or will you use a knife, or what do you use?
For me, it kind of depends on what mushroom it is. This is another discussion in this space. Do you pluck or do you cut? You know, does the mushroom care? You know, again, in my experience, and this is just my opinion, I don't believe the mushroom cares. I don't think there's much research to prove that wrong necessarily. So you can pluck or you can cut. One of the main reasons to cut, in my mind, is to keep your mushrooms clean. You know, as you know, we're pulling them out of the dirt. Often chanterelles are notoriously dirty mushrooms because the dirt gets kind of enmeshed in all those little ridges, and they're often kind of buried into the ground in these clusters. So, you know, if you spend the extra time to cut them in the field and brush the dirt off, your job when preparing them at home is a whole lot easier. If you put dirty mushrooms in your bag, you know, they sort of just like make everything in your bag dirty, and you get home with this massive mess.
And do you have a mesh bag that you put them in?
Yeah, we do. Actually, Trent and I designed a bag, and I should have brought it over here. I don't have one, but we sort of made 4 quadrants that have mesh sides and a mesh bottom, because I like to separate my mushrooms oftentimes by species. So we'll be out hunting and we'll have chanterelles and porcini and a lot of different mushrooms. Oh, Trent's bringing me this bag. Thank you, Trent.
But I've also heard something about the spores being able to be released as you're walking around. Is that true?
Yes, of course, mushrooms are constantly releasing spores. In fact, we're probably breathing them right now. There are so many spores. So sure, you know, this idea of allowing the spores to spread around and being a good steward, it's not as important, that part, as you might think, because I don't think mushrooms have a hard time releasing spores on their own. I mean, they are sending billions of spores into the air at any given moment. So, you know, yes, sure, you're releasing more spores, but in my mind, the mesh is really more for allowing the dirt to drop out. So you have cleaner mushrooms and airflow, because mushrooms don't like heat. They don't like plastic. So this idea of providing them with kind of like a meshy bottom and a lot of airflow is great, because oftentimes we'll be carrying 10 pounds of mushrooms, you know, in this one bag, which, you know, they're all kind of getting heavy and mushing each other. So all of those things are important, yes. But we do, you know, you don't have to have special equipment. You really don't. You could go out into the woods with any kind of bag, a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket with some holes drilled in it, for example, if you want, or you could take a plastic knife. It really doesn't matter. It's more about, you know, your own comfort, honestly. If we head back into the chanterelle for a second, just a few more identifiers. Chanterelles are always going to be growing in the ground, not on a tree or on a piece of wood. They're poisonous lookalikes that do grow on wood, so that's important to note.
And Barbara also put a link in the chat for poisonous identifier. So I'll include that in the follow-up.
Yay, thank you, Barbara. I appreciate your support. Awesome. One thing to know about chanterelles, which I think is pretty unique, is that they are, like I said, a fruity smelling mushroom. They smell delightfully like apricots. And so when we cook them, we often pair them with apricots. So I make jam out of chanterelles and apricots that we put in baked brie, for example, which is amazing.
And that's in your cookbook, I believe, right?
It is, yeah. And we make something called a duxelle, which if you've not heard about or tried, you should. It's fabulous. It's this idea that you cook the mushrooms, you chop them up, you cook them with onions and sherry and apricots, and you cook them in like a big cast iron pot for maybe 3 or 4 hours in your oven, and they turn into this sort of like jammy, really lovely and flavorful duxelle that you can then freeze, and you can turn that into a million different things. You can put it on pork, you can add cream to it and make a pasta sauce. There's so many wonderful things you can do with it.
Yum,
So,
I'm getting hungry.
yeah.
Also, there is a request. Can you hold up your bag one more time more closely?
Yes, here, hang on. I'm gonna back my computer up and show you the bag. So here's the bag, here's the quadrants. I
Got
don't know
it.
if you can see that. We have these bags handmade by a lovely little lady in Grand Junction, Colorado, and they're cool because they're upcycled. They are, what is it? They're old. They're made out of old Big Agnes sleeping pads, so they're waterproof.
That's neat.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. And we sell them on our website. We have a limited amount of them. They'll run out at some point, but I love them. Of course, I'm biased. We made them for ourselves, but
Good to know.
Yeah, good to know. Okay, so let's move on to the next mushroom, which is the porcini. I have to say this is probably my favorite mushroom. It is incredibly widespread. Europeans absolutely love this mushroom. They've been hunting them for forever. We have beautiful porcini in Colorado. In fact, I think some of the best. But you will find them all over the West. Really, they're not quite as widespread, I don't think, as the Chanterelle or the Morel that we will talk about. You can find them in the Midwest, but and maybe Barbara and other folks that are in that area that have more experience hunting in the Midwest can chime in. They're just not as prolific. They're an interesting mushroom in that in the West, in places like Oregon and Washington, they actually have 2 seasons. Trent and I, if we're lucky, in the spring, we head out to hunt burn morels to Oregon every year. And if we're lucky, we can also catch the spring porcini season, which is usually around the end of May, first week of June there. And then those mushrooms will also grow in the fall again in the dunes on the Oregon coast, which is awesome. If you ever get a chance to visit the dunes on the Oregon coast, I would highly recommend it. This is the Boletus genus. Here in Colorado, we have Boletus rubriceps, they're called. Generally, Boletus edulis is sort of the general species that's most widespread. These guys, again, have a symbiotic relationship with a tree. They are mycorrhizal with conifer trees. Here in Colorado, it's the Engelmann spruce, but you will find them in mixed conifer forest, spruce, fir, and pine. They are a super meaty mushroom. They're very earthy. They smell like the forest. One of my favorite things to do, which is kind of weird, but when we're hunting mushrooms, I love to just pick up a mushroom and put my nose right into it because the smell is a great way to identify, frankly, that apricot-y smell of the chanterelle. You can identify a chanterelle simply by smell alone.
Like wine.
Like a wine, like a fine wine. It's true. They all have a unique smell, and there's nothing like it, really. It's just the most amazing thing. These mushrooms remind me of the forest very much. I just feel like they have this really earthiness to them. They are unique in that they also do not have gills. they have something called pores, sorry. On the bottom of them, it's almost like this spongy, you know, you can even see these little tubes, depending how old they are. But when they're very young, their pores will start out white. As they begin to age, they become kind of more yellow. And as they're really old, they get green and brown and really gross looking. They do have some lookalikes. And by the way, there are so many different species of boletes, we call them. The only ones that I would consider porcini are, there are a few, the Edulus, of course, the Rubriceps in Colorado, the Rex Veris is the spring porcini in Oregon. So, you know, there's a million different species of boletes, but not all are considered a porcini, which is really the choice edible version of the king bolete, we call it. And in that case, a few other identifiers are this mushroom, when you cut it, some mushrooms will bruise or stain. We have a mushroom that can look very similar to a porcini in Colorado called a lexinum or an aspen bolete. And when you cut it, it turns blue, like the most amazing blue. And so
I'm sorry, that's a poisonous one?
No, it's not poisonous necessarily. People do eat it. It has been known to cause gastric upset for some folks. I think Europeans eat them all the time, so it's definitely not a poisonous mushroom. It's just here when we're hunting and we have porcini and we have lexinum, it's kind of like, why would I pick lexinum when I can get the porcini readily? So
yeah.
Trent and I don't really bother with them, but you know, I know a lot of people that do eat them.
And Kristen, just to do a time check, we have like 15 minutes left.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure that we can get through a lot of these slides.
Yes, perfect. We'll go quickly after this. Okay, so let's move on. These grow in the ground and they pair well. They hold well up against like red sauce and things like that because they've got such a nice flavor. Not necessarily a delicate mushroom. And on to the morels. So
Oh yeah.
I think the morels are probably the most, they create the most mania, that's for sure. You know, when morel season is starting, we sort of watch it kind of come across the country. It starts in the south for natural morels in sometimes as early as like the end of February and March. It just depends on the season, but you know, they'll start in places like, I don't know, the Carolinas and Oklahoma and Mississippi, and all these people are on the map finding their morels, and truly they spark this absolute mania. People just go crazy for these mushrooms, and they are of course delicious if you've never had them. Here in Colorado, so there's this idea of natural morels, right? And you're seeing pictures of natural morels, and then there's the idea of burn morels in the western states. So anything kind of west of the Rockies, you will have the opportunity to collect burn morels, which grow only in an old wildfire scar from the season before. And they will grow up to 3 years or so after a wildfire, as long as nature participates. Any morel loves moisture and heat. So these guys are going to come out when your soil temperatures get up to 50 plus degrees or so in a burn as well. But the difference between natural morels and burn morels is burn morels are prolific. Natural morels can be frustrating and difficult to find. So people collecting naturals oftentimes count their mushrooms. Like I found 50 today, for example. Sometimes you find just enough for dinner and you're thrilled. With burn morels, you would never count them because it's pounds. You know, it's 5-gallon bucketfuls in an hour sometimes. So they're incredibly prolific.
And how about the flavor profile between the natural and the burn?
You know, I think you have to have a super refined palate to tell the difference. People do say there's a difference. I feel like they taste almost exactly the same. Burn morels can be dirty. They are covered in a thin layer of ash often. So we wash them well. When you dehydrate them, that kind of ash turns into dust and sort of falls off. So to me, really the difference is just that burn morels can be a little bit more dirty than natural morels, but I
And
find
do you
they taste
wait and when you
same.
wash them? I mean, I usually brush my mushrooms, but when they're that dirty, how do you go about cleaning them?
Trent and I are not afraid at all to vigorously wash a mushroom if it needs washing. I know, any chef would probably cringe hearing that. But really the secret to doing that is if you're going to wash them, just make sure once you've rinsed them and they're full of water, you're not cooking them immediately. Often what we will do is, especially with chanterelles, which are, they hold a lot of moisture. We put them out on, trays, and we put a fan on them and bring them sort of back to their natural moisture level before we cook them or do anything with them, really. So as long as you are into this idea of spending some time preparing them, there's really no problem putting water on the mushrooms as long as you treat them properly.
Great information. Thank you.
Yeah. So morels are another mushroom that have lots of, I'll call them poisonous lookalikes, although people do eat a lot of their lookalikes. Morels are also an interesting mushroom in that they will make you very sick if you eat them raw. They have some sort of chemical that is akin to rocket fuel, and maybe Barbara can tell us because she's way more knowledgeable than me on this stuff. But it's released with heat. So when you cook them, that chemical releases and makes the mushroom safe to eat. All of their lookalikes have a similar chemical in them. But one of the easiest ways to identify a morel, and I think in the bottom right picture, you can see this pretty well, is that there is no sort of demarcation between the stem and the cap, if you will. It's sort of a one continuous line. And I didn't put a picture of a lookalike in here, but oftentimes you'll cut into a lookalike and it'll look kind of brainy inside, and you'll see you'll see stem and cap, kind of like that. A morel is always going to be continuous. So you can't tell where the stem ends and the cap begins. They are always hollow on the inside, and they have this idea of kind of pitted ridges. As you can see from the photos, whether it's natural morels or burn morels, they have a great variety in how they look. They can be sort of greenish, pinkish, brownish, yellow, black, even in some cases. So they have a great variety in what they look like, which is pretty cool. Let me go to the next slide, because here we're showing a few pictures of burn morels. These are pictures from a fire in Colorado from 2019. It was called the Lake Christine fire. The mushrooms that year were prolific. And in a burn, Mother Nature is really boss. With all mushrooms, Mother Nature is boss. These mushrooms love heat and they love moisture. So if you have rain and warm nights, they are going to come, and they will come like crazy. You can see by these pictures, here we are in just like a square foot of the forest, and I don't know how many mushrooms are in there, 10 something. Burn morels will grow in what's called flushes, and they move up in elevation. So when we were hunting this burn in 2019, we started at 8,200 feet, I believe, and we hunted all the way up to about 10,700 feet.
Wow.
And we hunted from June all the way through the end of August, and we just went up in elevation. So they're pretty amazing, because as compared to natural morels, those are a spring mushroom. They come and maybe they have a 2 or 3 week window if you're lucky to hunt them. So this is the mushroom that commercial hunters are after. So, if you're purchasing morels from a store, likely they've come from a burn, because a burn hunter will go out and in one day, for example, they shoot to collect at least 100 pounds of mushrooms.
And
So
don't they sell them retail like at $40 a pound or something like that?
yeah, they can. Yes,
Yeah,
I've seen
that's
them
what
for
I've
as
seen
much
them at.
as sometimes 70 or something. I mean,
Wow.
it just depends on what kind of year, how many mushrooms are flooding the market type of deal. But yeah, they're very expensive. So again, in my opinion, they look very much the same. They taste very much the same. They are a different species. If you were actually to sequence their DNA, they would show as a different species, but they look the same. They taste the same, and they create just as much mania. So super fun. So those were the 3 mushrooms I wanted to go over. If anyone has questions, throw them up in the chat about the mushrooms, please. Here's, the discussion on safety and etiquette, which we already sort of talked about a little bit. One thing I think to point out is this idea that you always want to cook your mushrooms. Not only because they are more bioavailable and nutritious for you if you cook them. Mushrooms have something called chitin. It's difficult for your digestive system to break down. So cooking them makes them more available to you. But also for safety reasons, like I said, especially with morels, you absolutely have to cook them or you will get very sick. So it's a good way to kind of avoid some stupid mistakes. Just make sure you always cook your wild mushrooms. Unless you're an expert, there are a few exceptions that you can eat raw. But another good tip, especially if you're new to wild mushrooms, even if you know, and you should know with 100% certainty before you eat anything, please make sure you absolutely know that it's safe and edible. But even if you know that and you've never eaten a certain mushroom before, it's always really great to start with just a little bit because your system has never encountered these things before. So, for example, Trent unfortunately is allergic to morels, and he will get very sick just eating morels, whereas nobody else, a lot of other people don't. So it's always good to just try a little, eat a few more the next day before you gorge yourself. Foray with someone experienced, it's always a great thing to do. Make sure you take GPS into the woods. Trent and I use something called Gaia GPS. It's an
That's
app.
what I use as well.
It's fantastic. We can share tracks. There's another one called Onyx that's also great. You can download the areas that you're going into before you head out, and therefore you don't need cell service. They still work fantastically. It's important to always know where your car is. You easily get turned around when you're staring at the ground for hours.
And do you find that, will you say recommending for beginners, so say you are on a hike and going off trail, do you just kind of try to keep in mind where the trail is, staying within 100 yards? And if you do that, do you think that you can be as likely to find mushrooms?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Oftentimes mushrooms love a disturbance. So you will often find them growing right on or near a trail. Morels love disturbances. Porcinis love to grow right around these areas these trails we're hiking on. So yes, at the same time, a lot of people put tons of work into those trails. So I like to kind of if I'm going to go off trail, I like to kind of go well off the trail, so I'm not causing damage to the trail itself, if that makes sense.
Great point.
Erosion
and stuff like that.
Yeah, you want to be respectful of all the work that goes into maintaining those trails, which is a massive amount of work. So if you get off the track, get well off the track, I think. And Trent and I are usually off the track somewhere often bushwhacking in the middle of the woods. So we turn on our track on Gaia so that we can find our way back. It's just what you do. You have to do it.
Super important. Since we only have 3 minutes, I'd love to answer or to ask you some of the questions that are coming in. Sure. There was one earlier about
I'm on chat with the computer. I finally got in.
Great. Let me just go through a couple of questions first, as far as Do you know of any poisonous lookalikes with the same apricot scent as the
Yeah.
chanterelle?
I don't know of any. Sounds like someone is coming through. Can you guys
Yeah.
maybe mute yourselves? Thank you. I don't know of any that have that same apricot-y smell. One of the most well-known poisonous lookalikes is something called a jack-o'-lantern. And I have seen jack-o'-lanterns that even in my hand, I have a hard time telling this is not a chanterelle. They can look very similar. So that idea of a white solid interior stem for me is one of the easiest ways. They don't have that apricot-y smell, but I will also tell you, chanterelles, let's say between Colorado and Oregon, for example, there are a lot of different species, but the chanterelles in Oregon are not nearly as apricot-y smelling as the ones in Colorado. So you may not always get that apricot smell. I think it has something to do with our super dry climate here that maybe intensifies that smell in them.
And this question will be very specific to the area as well, but Drew's curious about if you had to choose two trees to be able to identify, which would they be? Like, would it be aspen, or is it entirely dependent on where you are?
I think it's very dependent on where you are. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out conifer trees because often these mushrooms for us in Colorado and all over the West are growing in mixed conifer. For example, when we were hunting for natural morels in Oregon, they like to associate with a grand fir tree. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, of all these fir trees, which one is the grand fir and why? So it's definitely specific to region for sure.
And the app is that Kristen mentioned is Gaia, which is GAIA, I believe.
Yeah, it's GaiaGPS.com, I believe.
Great. And so, Kristen, I can't thank you enough. This has been so educational for me, particularly being just a novice.
Of course.
Yeah, really interesting information. Again, for everyone joining us, I will send out these slides with the resources. I encourage you to go online. And the thing that I'm going to do, my big takeaway, is joining some mycological association to take me out with them.
Absolutely do. You won't regret it. And I got to tell you, it's often no more than $30 to join. So
that's great.
It's not going to break the bank, and you will get connected to tons of amazing folks.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Kristen. And I would like to turn it over to Joni now to talk about upcoming events.
Thank you, Kristen, so much. I learned so many things, and one in particular for me was not to eat mushrooms before they're cooked. And that's very important information. Jordan always says, those aren't cooked yet, and I didn't know why, and now I do. So thank you very much.
Sure, yeah.
I learned so much and look forward to our next adventure as well. And Monica, you'll have to join us as well.
Definitely.
You should.
So with that, I'd love to invite you to some upcoming events. Next week, I'll be talking with Tony Puri about confidence. It's something that we all could use more of, and she is just a joy and delightful, and I know that you'll learn how to hone it and build it and own it. So join me for talking about confidence. And then my next interview is about understanding men, which I don't know about you, but it's something that eluded me for a long time. I'll be talking with Shayna James about her coaching of more than 1,000 men and what she's learned. So join me for that interesting conversation. We have several other events coming up. You can check those out on rebel11.com, and also some upcoming retreats. If you'd like to join us for hiking in Sun Valley, we have one spot left, and then we're doing a yoga retreat in Roslyn in November, and Roslyn's just right outside of Seattle, about 80 miles, and that's at our retreat center. I'm actually heading out hiking today on our Friday hikes in Seattle, and if any of you are here in Seattle, reach out to us and join us. There's more on the Revelers Revelry Lovin' Revelers private group if you want to know more. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay cool this weekend and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.